Welcome, folklorists, to the third annual Francis Lee Utley Memorial Lecture, sponsored by the Fellows of the American Folklore Society, your honorary and service organization. Before we begin, I'd like for the fellows who are here, who are gathered, to stand up and be recognized and applauded. This lecture is named for the founding chair of the Fellows, established in 1960. He had a long and distinguished career at Ohio State University, UCLA, and University of California, Berkeley, and he served as president of the American Folklore Society from 1951 to 1952. He made major contributions to the definitions and boundaries of folklore before his death in 1974. The Fellows have established a tradition of having the outgoing president of its organization give this distinguished lecture. And this year, we are particularly fortunate to have an eminent scholar whose work dovetails so wonderfully with the location and theme of this conference in New Orleans, Louisiana. Patricia A. Turner is Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education and Professor of African American and American Studies at the University of California at Davis, where she began teaching in 1990 after 5 years in Black Studies at the University of Massachusetts in Boston. Obviously a great field worker, I can say I met her a year later in 1991 when I was a visiting professor there. Obviously from the East, because I was wearing what I am now in 105-degree weather in Davis, California. And I can say she impressed me as another Easterner who obviously had assimilated because she was quite cool, collected, and very gracious. After December 17th of this year, she will assume the position of Dean and Vice Provost for Undergraduate Education at UCLA. With an appointment, I might add, in World Arts and Cultures and African American Studies. She received her PhD from the University of California at Berkeley, where she was mentored by the late Alan Dundes. In her illustrious career, she has made major contributions to the folkloristics of race and prejudice, legendary and humor, and African American material culture. She is the author of Crafted Lives, Stories and Studies of African American Quilters in 2009, Ceramic Uncles and Celluloid Mammies, Black Images and Their Influence on Culture, 1994, and I Heard It Through the Grapevine, Rumor in American Culture, 1993. She is also the co-author with Gary Allen Fine of Whispers on the Color Line, Rumor and Race in America, 1993. Her work is also evident in film and exhibitions, including Ethnic Notions of 1986, which received an Emmy Award for Best Research in a documentary film, the research that she did. In addition to this lecture, she has also been honored as a Benjamin Botkin Lecturer at the Library of Congress and the Archer Taylor Lecturer at the Western States Folklore Society. And for your society, she has served on the executive board and a member of the development committee. She's provided outstanding leadership these last 2 years as president of the Fellows, your honorary and service organization. Today, she will bring her considerable wisdom, her marvelous experience, her warm and gracious personality to bear on the subject of fried chicken, quilts, and hurricanes, reflections on fieldwork in Louisiana. Let's welcome.
Thanks, Simon, and thank all of you for eschewing the temptations of the French Quarter and all of our marvelous surrounding environs in favor of a talk in a PowerPoint about our surrounding environs. Only the most hardcore hotel ballroom, listening to a prepared talk and viewing slides about the world just beyond the threshold of the hotel, rather than merely cross that threshold and soak up the world for itself. I feel like the fellows have asked you to check into a top-dollar hotel room near Times Square on New Year's Eve, and then instructed you to watch coverage of the ringing in of the new year on television. To write this paper, I decided to pretend that I was a senior scholar, invited to reflect on her scholarly work and teaching, to connect the dots between conference papers, articles, and books I've done, and classes I've taught over the past 30 years. Narratives that articulate belief, personal experience narratives, rumors, legends, conspiracy theories, and material culture, quilts, and racist memorabilia have held my academic attention. I have probed these genres for evidence of worldview, identity, and what can be learned about racial assumptions, both those we have about ourselves and those we have of others. Very early on, Louisiana began to surface in archival and documentary work, and before long, I was able to do some field work in the Bayou State. Over the course of these years, I'm privileged to report I have held many a round-trip ticket from either Massachusetts or California to Louis Armstrong Airport. Because of its charged history and its volatile climate, both its cultural climate as well as its physical climate, Louisiana is a logical destination for someone with my academic inclinations. In rethinking the work I've done in and on Louisiana, I've concluded that for a folklorist trying to write about race at the end of the 20th and beginning of the 21st century, Louisiana brings numerous issues into particularly sharp relief. The discourse about the relative status of blacks and whites during the late 1970s and 80s was fraught with competing worldviews. On the one hand, many Americans were continuing to make the case that the power structure in the United States was still skewed too much in the direction of the status quo. While the civil rights movement had engendered many concrete steps in the right direction, forward, as my preferred presidential candidate would say, the codification of voting rights and the legal prohibitions against discriminatory practices was not nearly enough to better position blacks in the social, political, or economic order. On the other hand, many people, including folks who would self-identify as being supportive of the civil rights movement, were voicing dissatisfaction with efforts to stimulate black access to jobs, housing, and educational opportunities. The assault against affirmative action was underway, and it was accompanied by rationales based on arguments about fully redressed inequalities and historical revisions that claimed that Jim Crow racism had been confined to a small subset of the white population anyway. To this way of thinking, the then current generation of young black people did not suffer the injustices inflicted upon some of their forebears, hence efforts to provide them with any unearned access constituted an unreasonable redistribution from deserving whites. This was the context of my graduate school years, and I was a holder of a fellowship UC Berkeley provided only to minority students. Most of my compatriots were in the former category, undisturbed by my access to such funding. But my circle was not lacking in the latter category. One of my professors noted with an interesting tone of voice that I identified as black, implying I was guilty of some kind of reverse passing in order to get funding. No wonder I felt more at home in folklore than in my home department of rhetoric. So there I was, in the UC Berkeley Folklore Archives, circa early 1980s, when visiting scholar Bengta Klintberg was teaching a graduate legend course, and I needed a paper topic. I encountered this text, which spoke both to the seminar paper I wrote about ideological legends about how black people got their skin color and how their hair got its texture. And it also speaks to the intersections of Louisiana and my work. This is a talk about race, so I will be using the N word. You're folklorist, you can handle it. And the informant titled the story, Pick Temple's Ranch. Did I ever tell you the nigger ain't worth shit story? Thousands know it. It was all over Black Washington, D.C. There was this show, Pick Temple's Ranch, a children's show that came on about 5 o'clock. Oh, I remember everyone calling around. This was the early 60s, and you never saw a black face on television. Not one that wasn't cleaning up or looking after the whites or something. This is early integration. You know, extremely cautious. It was the usual procedure, introduce a few here and there. Now, Pick Temple had had a few on by this time. Anyway, there was this little boy, must have been 4. He was a confident, precocious little boy. My God, I'll die with this story in my mind. It's so right and cool at the same time. It really gets at the black psyche or something. Anyway, I was going to say the white man, the man. Pick Temple asks this boy, what do you want to be when you grow up? So the little boy looks up at him, all confident in everything. Well, he speaks up and says, a white man. Just as if he'd given it a lot of thought, as if a white man was an occupation, like a fireman. If I were writing down the story, I would write down white man, underlined, capitalized. So Pick Temple thinks there for a minute and finally says, why a white man? He should have stopped right there. Good while he was ahead. Well, the boy speaks up in a tone as if nothing's unusual. Because my mama says a nigger ain't worth shit. The TV went black right then and there. Phones went all over Black Washington. I think the whites were shocked, though, about the profanity, not the insight. Y'all weren't too bright in those days. I was thinking that boy must be grown now. I wonder what he's like. Someone should track him down. I went looking for a seminar paper topic, and I found a signature story that I would return to again and again. Although I only specifically cite this story in one of my works, it is there. It is in, I heard it through the grapevine and crafted lives, and virtually everything I've written and in all of the courses I teach. Even if some aspects of his recollection were to turn out to be superficially inaccurate, I recognized from my own family an embedded veracity. I knew that the history of the black presence in the New World was shadowed by presumptions of white supremacy. I knew that while many 60s-era black parents would have rejected the premise of this boy's mama, there were those who articulated such sentiments and children who had heard them. Documenting, analyzing, and teaching with these kinds of text as evidence was what I knew I wanted to do. Folklore archives, such as the one at Berkeley, were replete with jokes, riddles, and legends that reflected the persistence of racial stereotypes. Blacks were depicted as unkempt, violent, ignorant, ostentatious, and oversexed. Just as an example, one that does a little double duty, what's long and hard on a black man? The unemployment line. Beyond the filing cabinets of the archives, in some households and antique stores and flea markets, there were material objects that captured every verbal stereotype. At one end of the continuum were artifacts that unabashedly promoted white superiority. So in the archives, there were jokes such as, there's this guy, he walks into a bar, he's got an alligator on a leash. And the guy says to the bartender, do you serve Negroes here? And the bartender says, we serve anybody here. The guy says, give me a scotch and a nigger for my pet alligator. Or, what do you get when you cross an alligator and a roadrunner? A 100-mile-per-hour nigger chaser. There is a matching object, many matching objects, that depicts the realization of the message. On these objects, the alligators are personified, and the blacks, almost always children or men, are anthropomorphized. Elsewhere, I have documented the history of the juxtaposition of blacks and alligators and offered an analysis. Simon mentioned I'm a student of Alan Dundee's, so you can imagine the psychoanalytic point of view that's expressed in that piece. The most relevant point from that analysis for my case today is that focusing the alligator's jaws on unclothed black children or on men, there is evidence of a sentiment to rid an environment of blacks altogether. After all, the children won't reach adulthood if the alligators consume enough men. The future of the black race is tenuous. In the 70s and 80s, and it sometimes still occurs, these objects were labeled as, quote, black folk art, unquote. This was a particularly troubling categorization. It's bad enough to have mass-produced kitsch misidentified as your art, but it's really an insult to injury when the objects, in fact, are demeaning. In the 1980s, I borrowed the label contemptible collectible to refer to mass-produced material objects that were tangible, three-dimensional evocations of anti-black stereotypes. My quest to explicate the boy and the audience and the narrator in Pick Temple's Ranch led me to collect contemptible collectibles so that I could teach, document, and write about them. So what does all of this have to do with Louisiana? In a folk speech folder in the UC Berkeley archives, I found an entry from a white male student who claimed that in his native Louisiana, alligator bait was a nickname for black children. That doesn't mean that the alligator assaulting the black man motif is exclusive to Louisiana, but I've had no serious objections to the premise that this pairing occurred here. Since African Americans were escorted to the New World to be enslaved, there have been multiple perspectives on the black race. In some parts of the country, the South, a militant form of white supremacy dominated for centuries. In the North and elsewhere, there were at least some communities where more moderate views were discernible. And in the late 1970s and 80s, when many in the nation were eager to eviscerate any tangible evidence of racism, many in the South remained convinced that blacks were second-class citizens and consequently saw no reason to cloak this perspective. This was decidedly inconvenient for those eager to minimize the import of historical racism. Louisiana wasn't the only Southern locale to hang on to tangible reminders of Jim Crow. However, New Orleans, I think the case can be made, attracts many non-Southerners, in part by romanticizing antebellum culture in earlier times when blacks could be kept in their place. And hang on to this idea about blacks being kept in their place. I'm going to return to it later. So the tenacity of visible anti-black sentiment was for the consumption of others as well as locals. Of course, there were blacks here in the first place because of a need for their labor, and that reality is rendered in the material objects as well. Lots of objects recognize and celebrate the preferred role for African Americans. To be sure, images of blacks in the vestments of domestic service were available throughout the nation, indeed throughout the world. Louisiana tenaciously sustained subtle and even conspicuous markers of racism long after the Civil Rights Movement rendered public displays of anti-black sentiment inappropriate. Whereas in California, New York, Boston, I would go into an antique store or attend a collectibles fair and pay, say, $20 for supposedly antique souvenir Mammy Uncle Salt and Pepper shakers, on my first trip to New Orleans, I paid $4.95 for Mammy and Uncle Salt and Pepper shakers that were being sold as souvenirs in real time, and you can buy them now with no problem. It's important to note that much of the world of contemptible collectibles is souvenir tourist items. Vacationers and out-of-towners go into the French Quarter store to buy a Mammy and Uncle Salt and Pepper shaker and then bring them home. Or in the past, they sent someone a postcard with an alligator chasing a black man on it. So Louisiana should not take all of the heat for these items. If out-of-towners weren't buying them, merchants would replace them with more lucrative items. Nonetheless, a case can be made that much of the rest of the nation got smart, in the words of the teller of the Pick Temple's Ranch story. Here's how the owners of the company that makes Aunt Jemima pancakes made over their spokeswoman over a period of years. The makers of Louisiana coffee, however, waited quite a bit longer, and so the difference between the before and the after, this was a much more recent depiction, the one closest to me. And now you can buy Louisiana, but they've emancipated their spokeswoman completely and taken her off the packaging. Within Louisiana, and this may be applicable to other southern states, there's a significant segment of the population disinterested in rejecting or moving beyond the skewed racial power structure of slavery in the Jim Crow South. Because of my work in this arena, I found myself being greeted with comments like this. I was at a collectibles fair and I saw this really racist item and I thought of you right away. I was attracted to folklore because I recognized it as a path to understanding, in the words of Pig Temple's narrator, the black psyche or something. So on that first trip to New Orleans, documenting 495 salt and pepper shakers was a secondary concern. I was more interested in talking to people about fried chicken. My academic interest in fast food fried chicken stems from the late 1980s in Boston, Massachusetts, when I heard a contemporary legend that claimed that Church's Fried Chicken franchise was really owned by the Ku Klux Klan, and that they had corrupted the recipe so that when black men ate it, they would be sterilized. Prior to my documentation and analysis of that cycle, very little had been done by folklorists on contemporary legends that are particular to a specific ethnic community. I received lots of affirmative feedback at folklore meetings where I gave that first paper, lots of encouragement to further pursue rumors and contemporary legends in the black community. And Gary Allen Fine is here, and he was at that first paper, and it was like one of the first papers I'd ever given at a conference. And Gary was a well-established senior scholar at the time, and he came up and gave me suggestions afterwards, and as Simon noted, we ended up co-authoring a book. I had lots of affirmations from others as well. However, my fieldwork on the Church's text was conducted out of the South, mostly in Massachusetts, New York, and California. It was clear from the informants who found the accusation credible that part of their belief stemmed from their association of the Church's company with the South. While few people knew exactly where the Church's headquarters was located, and at that time it was in Houston, they did correctly presume the South. In their eyes, and these were almost exclusively black informants, a company with headquarters in the South was much more likely to harbor a racist philosophy. Shortly after the Church's Fried Chicken Company was purchased by Alvin Copeland, the CEO of Popeye's famous fried chicken and biscuits, a Louisiana company, another chicken-related cycle emerged, but this time it was less widely known. It's flipped now, but at this historical moment, Church's had many franchises nationwide, and Popeyes was still fairly local, and that's flipped a little bit. There are far more Popeyes nationwide now than Church's. The rumor Popeyes had to deal with was that its owner had donated $25,000 to the political campaign of David Duke, a former Grand Wizard of the Ku Klux Klan, who was then running for Senate from Louisiana. That was 1990. And then he would run for governor in 1991 and for president of the United States in 1992. Journalists and pundits, upon hearing contemporary legends in which African Americans profess credence in conspiracy or a contamination plot, are often nonplussed about what they perceive to be naive and unwarranted gullibility. But the Popeye cycle was compelling because in Louisiana, it was impossible to argue that the KKK was now a defunct organization. Whereas in many parts of the country, white supremacists were very much underground. In Louisiana, David Duke personified the KKK, ran for office, and got plenty of votes. The notion that flamboyant and profoundly Southern good old boy like Copeland, famous locally for his larger-than-life gestures, and in Louisiana, Al Copeland was kind of a Donald Trump figure, that he might contribute $25,000 to Duke's campaign was not outrageous. Of course, Copeland emphatically denied any association with Duke, and his denial and the evidence I looked at was all quite plausible and very likely. I mean, I don't think he gave the money. Daughter of parents who kept chickens and sold eggs, and a mother whose fried chicken recipe was superb, I had to keep thinking about the chicken. During that first visit to New Orleans, when, amongst other things, I was able to interview the Popeyes Public Relations Director at her posh Garden District home, I also found a community that shared my family's affection for fried chicken. And for excellent documentation of the complex relationship blacks have with fried chicken, I recommend to you Psyche William Forson's Building Houses Out of Chicken Legs. And is Psyche here? She was in the program. I don't know if she made it to the meetings, but it's a great book. For the purpose of understanding the function of the franchise chicken text to those who subscribe to them, my fieldwork points to the fact that some African American consumers were demonstrating an ambivalence about buying fried chicken, a symbolically, culturally rich food product from Southern-owned fast food franchises. The rumors and legends were registering confusion about the relative convenience, low price, and to some good taste of Church's or Popeyes in relation to the culturally preferred, lovingly prepared fried chicken of a mother or grandmother. People should be eating well-prepared fried chicken at home after church, not out of a bucket or a box in their car. They may have liked grandmas more, but absent grandmas, Church's or Popeyes would do, and that generated a cultural uneasiness. As I say, no evidence was uncovered that either Church's was guilty of tampering with their chicken or that Copeland had supported David Duke. But the success of both companies is clearly linked to the frequency with which consumers opt to spend their money to eat out as opposed to eating at home. At this time period, the early 90s, the decision to not prepare your family a meal and to succumb to convenience was one that triggered some self-criticism. If I were really a good spouse or parent, I would be making our meals myself. If we read the rumors and legends as saying that these companies were not looking out for the best nutritional and economic interests, we see an element of factuality underlying the rumor or legend. From the very beginning of my work on rumors and legends in the Black community, I prioritized sharing the documentation of the text in ways that don't denigrate the tellers. It wasn't always easy to convince those outside of the community, and even many within the Black community, that someone who professed credibility in the Church's text was worthy of respect. People wanted to believe the KKK a relic of the past. But the Popeyes text and the unfortunate reality of a viable white supremacist earning the votes of many Louisianans made this task somewhat easier. 15 years after the peak in the circulation of the Popeyes text, Hurricane Katrina devastated the Gulf region. If you map Hurricane Katrina onto the conditions for rumor mongering advanced by Tamatsu Shibutani or Gordon Alport, the suddenness, confusion, destruction, inadequate communication throughout the region made it ripe for the discourse of rumor and legend. The texts that received the most public attention were those that circulated within segments of the Black community. I'm sure many in this audience could recite them easily. The basic text was that some representative of the power structure, a power structure presumed to be white, had dynamited the levees and caused the lower Ninth Ward, an almost exclusively Black part of New Orleans, to flood. However you think the levees, oh, there's my friend David. However you think the levees were breached, this was a catastrophic event, and because of it, lives were lost and homes were destroyed. Journalists immediately heard versions of this text, and it became so widespread and was given credence by so many blacks that one of its strongest believers, community activist Diane Cole French, also known as Mama D, testified about it before Congress. Her strongly worded accusations perplexed and antagonized many in power who just couldn't understand how anyone could believe the government would maliciously, intentionally, try to kill scores of poor blacks. Yet to the black believers of the text, the whites in power in 2005 were linked to the whites who had voted for David Duke, to the whites who had sold or bought postcards with alligators in hot pursuit of black children. In all rumor, conspiracy theory, legend articulations, believers cherry-pick relevant evidence to bolster their claims. In the minds of these individuals, the more affluent areas of the city, such as the Garden District and the French Quarter, were spared the worst of the storm damage. How to explain that one of the poor black areas happened to be the one that, many hours after the storm had moved on, was the one that was devastated by a flood? When I spoke to folks here and elsewhere about the dynamiting of the levees, I heard from people absolutely certain that it had happened. Both black and white people, and this is a shift over time, because when I was doing my field work on the church's text, I found very few white people who had ever heard, and really none that believed the text. But I didn't have trouble finding white people that believed that the levees were intentionally dynamited. There were many more who claimed not to be convinced, but who assured me that it could have happened, or that it was the kind of thing they would have done if they could. Same thing as I heard with the church's belief. One difference worth noting is what I said about whites very sympathetic to this position. And then I also found many blacks, including from the Ninth Ward themselves, who were not only non-believers, they were weary of being associated with the black conspiracy theorists. I conducted a focus group with several graduate students from Southern University in Baton Rouge. An African-American female student told me about her household on the eve of Katrina. Her father worked for the Army Corps of Engineers and was on assignment in Ohio. From there, he had heard the increasingly dire weather forecast and urged his New Orleans-based family to evacuate before the storm. Like so many residents of New Orleans, they did so. They got out before the storm. I think sometimes the news coverage of Katrina obscures the fact that far more people heeded the advice to leave and then did so. This family settled in with extended family members in Baton Rouge. Following the storm, the graduate student was offered and accepted a part-time job with FEMA, which, as you know, was doing some hiring after the storm. So this is a black graduate student working for FEMA, and her father was a long-time and highly placed employee of the Army Corps of Engineers. I can still hear the hurt in the voice of this student who talked about how counterproductive she believed the rumors were. To her family, and I heard this from other students as well, those keeping the levees as intentionally breached stories alive were actually hurting other blacks, making the race as a whole look uneducated and paranoid. At the end of the story, the student did smile and reported that both she and her father had work-assigned t-shirts with Army Corps of Engineers and FEMA on them, but they didn't dare wear them in public. And this is the kind of story you can only get doing field work. Far less media attention was devoted to the rumors and legends that circulated in which Katrina evacuees were depicted as unworthy victims. The beliefs that some blacks shared about the levees are much better known. These texts were gleaned from internet postings. Many of them were contained within viral email and blogs. They were disseminated through the internet more than anywhere else. The internet lends itself to much lengthier recitations, some of these 5 and 6 pages long, but they're very formulaic. This is what they're commenting on. So in the narratives about the evacuation, the structure includes 2 different kinds of introductions. One, the well-meaning introduction, the person who's well-meaning in all of this, and the other person who is involved with the evacuees because he doesn't believe
what the media is saying about what's going on. Then they talk about the ethos of the volunteers, the people who came to assist the evacuees, and the generosity of people towards them. Then they move on to explications of the dissatisfaction with what's been offered to them, criminality, the laziness of the victims, and then usually end with a little lesson learned. So this is an example of a well-meaning introduction. My dad went to volunteer, this is the way that one starts, and later on after his first day volunteering, it says, my dad went home and slept most of Saturday the next day, got up and had to go back to bed. Remember, he'd been in the hospital not 2 weeks ago with chest pains. He's okay now, but still. And then the ones that are getting involved because they're suspicious of the media coverage. I went to volunteer on Saturday at the George R. Brown Convention Center. I have been watching the news lately and have seen scenes that made me want to vomit. It was people's behavior. The people on TV, 99% being black, were demanding help. They were not asking nicely, but demanding, as if society owed these people something. And then the text all have something about the other volunteers. These were ordinary Houstonians coming with truckloads and trucks full of water, diapers, clothes, blankets, food, all types of good stuff. I then went inside the building and noticed approximately 100,000 square feet of clothes, shoes, jackets, toys, and all types of goodies, all organized and ready for the people in need. The generosity of donors. Houstonians are going nuts being nice to these people. Free hamburgers, free admission to the Children's Museum. And then it moves into attributes of the evacuees. Evacuees came slowly to this mountain of food that is worth serving a king. I tell them we have two types of great deli sandwiches to choose from, ham and turkey. Many look at the food in disgust and demand burgers, pizza, and even McDonald's. The criminality is also highlighted. Upon their arrival here in Salt Lake City, 2 people immediately deplaned and lit up a joint. During the course of medical evaluations, it was discovered that parents were using their kids to carry loads of looted jewelry with the price tag still on and other items. And laziness. Why are all these fat blacks laying around on cots, sleeping while white people are lining up by the thousands to serve them meals? And then the stories end with this kind of closure. If we continue to reward these losers, then we will soon destroy our great country. I just witnessed selfish, arrogant, unappreciative behavior by the very people who need help the most. Now these same people who curse me, refuse my city's generosity, who refuse to help themselves, are demanding handouts on their own terms. How can we explain the venomous voices reflected in the ungrateful victim narratives? Clearly, for some folks, the media's depiction of the evacuees as victims deserving assistance violated a worldview in which poor blacks were responsible for their difficult circumstances. In order to justify resisting the calls to charity, these narrators latch onto and circulate stories that seem to say, no, it's all their fault, and they deserve what happened to them. And I'm sure many of you remember those days. MSNBC, CNN, and their sibling media outlets projected round-the-clock stories showing an impoverished, mostly black population devastated by a fierce hurricane, an act of God. Multiple acts and non-acts of men exacerbated that dangerous crisis, resulting in a wide-scale human disaster, one that morally sound people ought to care about and contribute to. I doubt the narrators and those who forwarded their accounts held Louisiana's poor black population or any other black population in high esteem before the storm. With the dissemination of the unworthy victim stories, narrators can reposition minorities, quickly mitigating their victim status and bestowing victim status on hapless do-gooders who volunteer at bus stops or shelters, offer up housing or jobs. The rumors and legends resonate with the 21st century's version of the cohort who embraced Lights Out in the 1990s, and reminds us that in spite of obvious signs that some African Americans have, in the words of the Jefferson theme song, moved on up. The combination of mobility and sympathy continues to trigger visceral hostility. Katrina's worst impact to this way of thinking was not the disruption of New Orleans per se, but rather that disruption was resulting in the unwelcome migration of poor blacks with all of their pathological baggage who were headed to a neighborhood near you. Remember what I said earlier about nostalgia for a time when blacks remained in their place. Just as it was important for me to affirm that not all blacks believed the levees were intentionally breached, it certainly wasn't the majority of whites who circulated or found these texts persuasive. Nonetheless, the intensity of the anti-black hostility is sobering, as are the connections between the images and those in the contemptibles collectibles sphere. When I was looking for images of Diane Cole French, the two that I showed in the earlier slide were the most common ones, where she personifies the angry black woman. I had a really, really hard time finding anything flattering, and then I stumbled upon these of her with quilts, and I don't know the story behind her and quilts yet. I'd love to figure it out, but it makes for a good marker to the next section of this presentation. Some people told their Katrina stories in words. Some expressed their storm stories in other ways. This quilt was made by an evacuee. Once she believed herself reestablished and back in a good place, she took the clothes that she'd been wearing on the day of the evacuation, as well as the clothes she received in her temporary refuge in Baton Rouge, and made them into a quilt. The final component of my scholarship has come through my documentation of African American quilters. In Crafted Lives, I argue that the stories of African American experience can be told by way of the circumstances that surround black quilting. In the time that remains, I want to share the ways in which my exchanges with Louisiana quilters have informed my work and the way I've been able to use my ethnographies of them to reinforce important understandings of African American culture. One of the common oversimplifications of quilt making is that women quilt because their mothers and grandmothers taught them to quilt. Well, my Louisiana-based quilters provide evidence that that's not always the case. This is the late Mrs. Daisy Anderson Moore, who lived into her 90s, long enough to see Barack Obama inaugurated as president. Mrs. Moore proved to be, of all the quilters I've ever documented and interviewed, Mrs. Moore was the best about initiating letters, exchanges between us, calling me up. She was a wonderful correspondent, because I could never be in Louisiana with her as much as I liked, but she really helped me keep the connection going. She lived in a spacious home very near to the Southern University campus, where her late husband, a PhD from Ohio State University, had taught philosophy. A purist might maintain that Mrs. Moore's quilts aren't really examples of folk art. She is clear that she did not learn to quilt from her mother, even though her mother was an accomplished seamstress who supplemented her family's income by taking in sewing. Mrs. Moore was an adult, a high school science teacher in a segregated school, when her first husband was stationed overseas during World War II. The hours between getting home from school and going to bed were difficult for her, as she imagined every kind of incident her husband could be facing in the war zone. A neighbor encouraged her to take up quilting and offered to teach her. Mrs. Moore had a bag of dresses that her mother had kept, so she used the fabric from them for her first quilt top. The quilt lessons had their desired impact. They distracted her for the duration of the war. But when her husband was once again stateside, she put away the quilting until her children were adults. She then saw quilting as a way to occupy her time and to tell stories. She was a narrative quilter who celebrated her remarkable family in her quilts. Although a proficient sewer, she augmented her World War II lessons with books. In her words, which I can imagine coming from many in this audience, quote, "I'm a person who loves books. Look like anything I'm going to get into, I really go wild with the books. I need to cull some of them out. It doesn't apply to anybody here, right? I bought a book, How to Quilt, and a quilting primer, and I taught myself. I follow instructions pretty well. The story of one of Mrs. Moore's story quilts has provided me with much needed ammunition in my quest to demonstrate that the scholarly quilting world is overly obsessed with debunking the contemporary legend that blacks used quilts as maps to navigate the Underground Railroad. Hi, Marcia. In my 1997, my first visit to Mrs. Moore, she shared about 20 quilts with me, patiently telling me how she came to select the fabric and design for each, and what the story of her family it was intended to represent. And I noticed that all of the quilts that she was showing me, she was talking about them very much in the past tense, having made them quite a while ago. I asked her which of the quilts was most recently finished, and she pointed to one a few years old. "So you aren't quilting now?" I asked. Sadness enveloped her, and she said, quote, "A lot of people do work when they are depressed. I do work when I'm happy. Well, I lost my husband in '92 and my son too, and look like I've gone through a period of 5 or 6 years of being very sad. I can't get into quilting as much as I did when he was living, because every time I'd make something, I'd say to him, 'See this, look what I made,' and he would love it. He would fuss over her work and beam with pride. Without him to praise her work, she gave it up until 2003. Then one of her letters, which had that glorious penmanship of people who took penmanship classes at the beginning of the last century, came. And she indicated that 2 of her quilts had been accepted into the Southern University's Black History Month quilt exhibit. She was particularly proud of the new one, the one she had done linking her family to the Underground Railroad quilt. And that's the one closest to me. So as many of you know, I, like so many of us who study quilt history, have been plagued by the contemporary legend, and I really think that's the way to think of it, that quilts contained a code that fugitives, slaves understood, and that led them along the Underground Railroad to a free state. Mrs. Moore, a retired high school science teacher, she taught chemistry, biology, and physics, had gotten her hands on the book that advances this the most, Hidden in Plain View, and was inspired so much by it that she abandoned her self-imposed quilt moratorium and took to the needles and thread. When I was next able to come to Baton Rouge, she told me about each of her ancestors in the quilt, which was hung on a prominent wall in her house. Describing the second square, she said, "That's my dad. At that time, school teachers could have taught with a little learning after high school, but the salary wasn't sufficient. He went out to California for a while, but the only thing he could do there was shine shoes. He came back to Texas, and he saw an ad in the paper where you could be a railway clerk if you studied and went down to take an examination in Houston at that time. And he did. So he was a railway clerk for 37 years. He sent 8 of his children to college, which at that time, in the 30s, was remarkable." She's right, that is remarkable for a black man. She juxtaposed photo transfer images of her family members with quilt blocks purported to be part of the secret code. This linking of an individual black's family's history to a topic in black history writ large is quite common in African American story quilts. To Mrs. Moore, the publication of Hidden in Plain View was a godsend. It motivated her where nothing else had. Although this was the first of the recent quilts she'd finished, it wasn't the last. Another had hung in that Southern Black History Month show, and she was sewing when I got there that day. She had several quilts in progress. I have argued elsewhere that it was often the case with contemporary legends that while the surface story is false, there's a fundamental truth that undergirds the narrative. No, fugitive slaves did not know to look at the flying geese block and determine the safest way to flee. But those ex-slaves who made their way from slavery to freedom and the abolitionists who aided them were brave and courageous. Mrs. Moore's ancestors deserve the prominence she gives them on the quilt. Thus, with her stories, I can illustrate that 1, not all black women learned to sew from their mothers. 2, that even at the beginning of the 20th century, there was an educated black middle class. This is a black woman teaching science during World War II. and that contemporary legends can serve positive ends. Mrs. Moore's husband was deceased by the time I met her, but that was not the case with Willie Rivers, the husband of Mrs. Jeanette Rivers, when I met them in Zachary, Louisiana. Willie was a veteran too, although a career for him, and his exposure to the world beyond the 1950s convinced him that he did not want to live his adult life in Louisiana. When he courted Jeanette, he made it clear that they were not starting out married life in the South. This required Jeanette, who had never traveled outside of Louisiana, to take a series of buses from Louisiana to Oakland, California. A captivating storyteller, Mrs. Rivers ends the account of her trek to California by saying that after arriving at his sister's house in Oakland, Willie took her on another bus to Reno, Nevada. And quoting her, "And so we did, and that was the 10th of March, 1953. And I had left Louisiana on the 14th of February. After that, we just had no problems. Every day been Sunday since, with us since then." And she was telling me that story 44 years after her wedding. Black family life is often under assault, and the story of the tender love affair that united Willie and Jeanette Rivers proves how strong a black marriage can be. Mrs. Rivers' story of how she learned to quilt is one that I repeat in almost every talk I offer about quilting because it seems to help people to understand some of the profound differences between Mrs. Rivers' era and her own. In this case, and our own. In this case, it is about poverty and just how poor people were. Mrs. Rivers' first doll was a corncob doll. She decided to try to make it a new outfit, and without asking permission, took fabric from the stash her mother saved for making quilts. When her mother recognized the fabric on the doll, she punished Jeanette with a severe whipping. I asked her if the punishment was about taking the cloth without permission. Was the lesson that her mother wanted her to learn that she needed to ask? She said that was part of it, but that even the amount of cloth that would be used for a corncob doll was precious. Her family, including her mother, sharecropped, as did all of the families in this part of Louisiana, Zachary. There was no easy access to white families who would provide cast-off clothing or secondhand goods. In these days, there were no Walmarts with McClothes for sale at cheap prices. When the message I want to convey to my students concerns just what abject poverty means, this story to young people who have always had fabric in abundance really makes the point. I'll conclude with the very first Louisiana quilter I documented, Ella Mae Bolton, the grandmother of one of those students. After using that example, she came up to me and she said she was a fourth-generation quilter, and that her grandmother would soon be visiting her family, and she offered to bring her to Davis to my office hours. Of course I took her up on that offer, but I'm sure you know that a faculty office doesn't lend itself to this kind of field work. I just, it was a sacrifice, but I had to accept Mrs. Bolton's invitation to visit her in Bogalusa as soon as I could. When I got to her home the first time, I pulled up in a rental car to the address she had given me. The front of the house looked completely unused, whereas there was a driveway with cars parked at the side, signaling to me that this might be one of those families where the front door is more an architectural flourish than an actual portal. Using my first ever cell phone, I called to let her know I had arrived and to ask if I should come to the side door. She responded, "Honey, I've got 3 doors on my house and you're welcome in any one of them." I've got 3 doors on my house and you are welcome in any one of them. I always felt completely welcome at Shea Bolton, just as I always felt completely welcome in Louisiana. Is Louisiana still in need of progress on racial and social equality matters? Absolutely. Our skill set, the skill set of well-trained folklorists, can render visibility to both the vestiges of racism as well as the elements of everyday life that sustain so many Louisianans in spite of the many hardships this geography imposes upon them. There is so much work that folklorists can do here, and it can make a difference. At the risk of sounding like I have an outsized ego, the fact that reporters called me after Katrina, indicating that my work contextualizing folks who were sharing rumors would be helpful in their stories. I got called by the editor of The New Yorker, who had read I Heard It Through the Grapevine like 12 years earlier, and said, I need to talk to that folklorist before I write the story. There's so much more work that can be done here. The quilters that I documented relish the affirmation of their talents that comes from this process. The folklorists based here, and I wanted to name them, but I'm terrified of leaving someone out. But I think that they're all in the program under the local arrangements list. All of those folks, plus Carl Lindahl, who I think they've adopted as a Louisianan, are completely welcoming of those of us who come from other places to do our work. Carolyn Ware and others have set me up with their classes for interviews. It's so supportive of this environment. Their own work is superb, and it does make a difference to the people who are here. In addition to thanking them, I'd also like to thank the many folklore communities I've been a part of over the years. The Association of African American Folklorists, the Dundee's Disciples, the Quilt Scholars, the Isklar family. Each time I come to Louisiana or anywhere else to do field work, it is better and stronger because of what I've learned from all of you. Thank you. So if you didn't hear in the back, the question was whether or not the recent public attention to Chick-fil-A and the CEO's anti-gay philosophy, openly homophobic philosophy, is related to what I saw with the churches and Popeyes and others. And it is in an odd kind of a way. He exists as a CEO very different from most people who come to own major corporations because he's so willing to be public and to pay, he thought, the consequences of his beliefs. But most of these CEOs are only thinking about selling the product. That's their God, you know, and there's no philosophy that they have about any group of people that's going to override their desire to increase the profit margin. So he's a bit unique compared to the kind of people that I and the other sort of Isklar people in the room have studied in that position. Diana.
I'm speaking here as a total Pat Turner groupie. Sorry. I gotta say, for those of you who may not have heard, I'm speaking here as a total Pat Turner groupie. And what I've been really anxious to hear about in terms of recent work is about the Obama election. I can't say myths because, but what you have to say about what people are saying about the election.
Sure, and I had a hard, it's obviously hard to link that to just Louisiana because it's certainly a national, if not international, set of rumors that have been tied to him since the Democratic Convention in 2004, where he made that speech that catapulted him into the limelight. Almost immediately after that speech, the text began to circulate, connecting him, saying that he was a Muslim and Islamic, and there's not a great deal of geographic literacy amongst the people who share these kinds of texts. So you get all kinds of distortions of the identities of people in these texts. And the Muslim text dominated up until the day after he was elected. And the day after he was elected, almost immediately, the shift went to what had been evident but not as prominent, which was that he wasn't a citizen. And what circulated then and got a lot more attention, were the birther stories. And I think and I've argued elsewhere, that the reason for this is that even if it were to suddenly be discovered that he had the wrong, inappropriate religious ethnic affiliation, you couldn't remove him from the presidency based on that. But if people were if they were able to prove that he wasn't a citizen, that might be grounds for impeachment or some other way of removing him from office. So the shift went, for the most part, then to the birthers. And one of the things that the birther text, and there are all kinds of others as well that were prominent in the first campaign, that he wouldn't say the Pledge of Allegiance, that he wouldn't sing the national anthem, that he bought a campaign plane from another presidential candidate, and he had the flag, the American flag that it was on it, painted over, that he wouldn't wear a flag pin on his lapel. All of these texts saying that he wasn't one of us, he wasn't an American, were really prominent, but the birther one has had the most legs. And my contemporary legend colleagues in the room will I think agree. It's very rare for these texts to completely go away. Once they're out there, there's no document that you can show. There's no birth certificate. There isn't anything that's going to mitigate the tenacity of these texts, because the people who tell them believe it the way they believe their faith. And when you contradict this, and we use the word belief for a reason, and faith for a reason, when you contradict them, it's as if you're telling them they've got the wrong God, that they've got a false God or a false principle. I was actually kind of cheered by Donald Trump's recent offer of $5 million to President Obama if he would show his birth certificate and his admissions materials and his grades from college, because it suggests a kind of desperation on that side of, and with all due respect to any people who are in that political party in this room, it does suggest a kind of desperation, and the media has been reporting it as such, so I actually kind of think of it as a good sign. But it would be my prediction that hopefully, many decades into the future, when President Obama dies, I think it'll be the case that in his biographies and his histories, this connection will be made, and people will say, you know, he was born in Kenya, or he was born in Indonesia, which sometimes actually shows up in the really weird ones.
Step up to the microphone.
I'm so happy to be here to hear you. My name is Sharon Warner. I'm from Chicago. I'm part of Neighborhood Writing Alliance, and we're going to be on a forum later on about what you just said about the president's citizenship. It disturbs me that so many of our citizens are not educated to the fact that the definition of a native-born American is someone who is the child of one parent who is a citizen. His mother was born in Kansas. It doesn't matter if Barack was born on the moon. Somebody should have said that earlier and at least tried to shut this down. But what I actually wanted to comment it was about the ungrateful victims in Katrina and the differential of reporting. They even pointed this out at the time. They had a picture of a white couple taking things from a store, and the caption was going for food.
Yeah.
They had a picture of black people doing the same thing, and it was labeled looting. It's not looting when your whole neighborhood is destroyed. Whatever is there is, you have to get it however you can. Thank you so much for everything you said today.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you for a fine presentation. My name is Zora Neal University. I wondered about the rumors, if you knew that that idea of the levees being blown up was actually a Hurricane Betsy rumor.
Yeah, it was. Yeah, I didn't have time to go into this, and it actually, in maybe back with the dates, in 1927,
Yeah.
there was a hurricane, and there was an intentional diversion of the waters at the time, and the notion that the less important parts of New Orleans should be sacrificed. So there's actually a historical precedent for the diversion of the floodwaters that real old timers could speak to. And Betsy, yeah, it absolutely, and it came up in Betsy because it was more likely in Betsy in '64 that people remembered 27, whereas it's less likely in 2005. You know, you've really got an old timer that's remembering 1927.
And just a comment, thank you for mentioning that the majority of the residents evacuated. And in a city that was majority black, it's interesting to me that the vehement narratives also get pronounced when that flies in the face of people who were born and raised here. Our names go back 300 years, and it flies against the friendliness that is indigenous to our culture. So that kind of lack of appreciation, I wonder how long those people were living here.
Yeah. I think you make excellent points, and if I had had more time, and Carl Lindahl has done, and other folks have done work on this, the narrating of Katrina stories is much more populated by generosity and goodness in terms of the kinds of things that I'm sure that are in his surviving Rita and Katrina archive, and those texts are extraordinarily moving and reflect the generosity, neighborliness, and all of those characteristics I think that you're pointing to. Nick?
I too really appreciate what you've had to say. I do want to mention one of the most amazing rumors, though, which is the idea that came out within about 3 days that armed bands of black men in SUVs were headed to Baton Rouge with automatic weapons. And I'm thinking, what are they going to do? And we heard it in Lafayette as well, where I and family decamped, and it was pretty quickly debunked when General Honoré arrived. Of course, his great line to the soldiers was, "Boys, put down your guns. We're here to help people, not kill them." And then over time, I mean, we got some justice in the sense that essentially the worst rogues were the rogue police that killed people on the Danziger Bridge.
Right.
But you know what? They're going to jail, most of them. And so that was in a way, a positive outcome. A couple of things. The line came out, the storm was an equal opportunity destroyer. To some degree that was true, and I should say really the flood. Though it is true that the lower lying Backertown neighborhoods got it worse, and most of those were poor African American, Afro-Creole, and in some cases white. But there were some areas that were very wealthy that were trashed. But the reality is that what was the reception in certain places and who could return? And that was really the big issue. And there were people who went places where they actually got a better life and more respect and better jobs and didn't want to come back. Then there are places people went where they really wanted to come back for all kinds of reasons but couldn't because they didn't have the means. So the story gets more and more nuanced. But I would end on a positive note here. This recovery is about intangible culture, it's about family, it's about neighborhood, it's about wanting to be in the ritual, festival, cuisine, and built environment of this city and the region. And it is a message to the world of the power of culture as agency in recovery, whether it's recovery from recession or environmental problems or politics or war. And I think New Orleanians are very proud of this reality. And in the African American communities, the greatest tangible result of that intangible reality is that the second lines, the great processions that go with social aid and pleasure clubs, are now seeking visitors to be part of them. Not just other folks from other second line parade clubs, but people from all over, whether they're tourists or academics or students. And there's enormous pride that the second line is the ultimate street voting democratization of the needs people have for both social aid, helping each other, and pleasure. And the ability to have conveyed that, I think, is very powerful here now. And I don't think you'll find too many people who don't think this is a much better city after what the catastrophe unlocked with culture, locally and nationally. Thanks for your comments, though, because we don't get to hear about the quilting very often in the middle of this, or all the rumors that we feel victimized by. Thank you.
One of the neatest things that I've gotten to do since the storm was Alan Toussaint came to UC Davis, and they asked him if he would agree to be interviewed by me, and they also arranged for a faculty member who specializes in floods from geography to be there. So I interviewed a specialist on storms and Toussaint, and if you put my name in YouTube, you can find it. And it was really, really interesting to hear his story, and then of course he performed. And at the end of his performance, after the first or second encore, he went backstage and he got this big bag of beads and masks and the swag of New Orleans. And he and his fellow musicians came out into the audience. And these weren't just like little masks, like your basic sort of masks. These were elaborate ones with feathers and jewels and sequins, many of them, and he was just giving them to the audience. And he said that he was doing this on behalf of Louisiana, to thank all of the people across the country who had reached out to his city at their time of need, and that this was a small thing that he could do to express thanks. And that kind of sentiment and that kind of generosity was just so moving to see.
Hi, Jennifer Shacker from University of Guelph. Thank you so much for a wonderful talk. And I had a quick question because I've been working with an international community of quilters who are very young, they're in their 20s, and they're overwhelmingly white. And I'm really curious about whether you get a sense of how the younger generation of African American women are viewing quilting, whether there's an interest in quilting, whether there's a passion for it, or whether it's something that's just sort of receding within the community.
It is not receding at all, and every year it grows. And I would recommend to you a book by Kyra Hicks, the title of which is 6.1. And that's because according to the quilt survey, how often do they do that, Marcia? Every 3 years there's a major quilt survey that's conducted. And Kyra asked the people writing it if she could have the data on ethnic participation in quilting. And so they were happy to break it out for her. And each 3-year interval it goes up. And her book is called 6.1 because the last time 6.1 million African Americans self-identified as quilters. And that's a growing number. I'm a member of the African American Quilt Guild of Oakland, and I talk about that guild a lot in my book as well. And our membership is growing, and the number of people who attend our quilting workshops increases every year.
Are you sensing that there are younger women?
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. So those communities aren't really looking to each other at the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
In the back with the black turtle, looks like a black turtle.
You can come forward.
Yeah, so first a comment about the rumor at Lower Ninth Ward levee. I mean, it kind of flies in the face of Lakeview and, you know, some of the other levee that broke. But my comment is about the alligator images. So in the writings of a couple Nigerian writers, Uche Machada and Chinua Achebe, there are alligator stories, children who disappear. Also in Number One Ladies Detective Agency, the HBO version, there's one of the stories there. And I wonder if you found any connection between the images that you saw here in Louisiana with some of those African stories.
Yeah, I'm aware of the stories that you talk about, and what I find here is that these items and these jokes are shared by people beyond the world of the alligators. So it's not something that's shared. If within the Black community, it is sometimes the case that people will have, just like within the white community, people will have genuine stories about besting the alligator in some kind of a way that are based on perhaps real encounters with alligators. So there is certainly that, but the really derogatory images here are not from people who have alligators as one of their sort of cultural items. And so I think there's a difference between the way in which they were depicted at this period of history and the sort of way in which, because they're a figure of the environment, the African writers are writing about them.
Thanks for your talk. I'm Kate Verdon from Ohio State. I'm wondering if you're familiar with a story that sort of circulated as a joke in the same sort of spirit as the jokes you were talking about earlier with the alligators. That was a description of a post-Katrina news interview where a woman was asked about how she felt about the destruction of churches in her community.
Yeah.
This is an African American woman supposedly who then said, in Louisiana we eat Popeyes.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you could talk about that sort of apocryphal story in the context of the Popeyes and churches legends that you were discussing earlier.
Yeah, I think that it's as much a comment on the culture, the cultural significance of chicken within the community, that in a way it dominated. It gets she takes that and trumps the hurricane by talking about the affection for the chicken. It's also an acknowledgement of the fact that the part of I think the original ambivalence about the franchise fried chicken was that we ought to be staying away from it. But the fact that our chicken is Popeye's chicken is saying something about the fact that she's not making chicken herself on Sunday anymore, perhaps like her mother or grandmother did. She is stopping by Popeye's and getting the chicken on the way home. In my house, at least, it would have to go on good china. You would have to take it out of the box. Hybridization.
Meryl?
First, I want to reiterate or second Diana's comment. I'm a Pat Turner groupie. And I hope we get a chance to talk later, because I'll tell you two stories, one about the N-word and one about super educated African Americans at the turn of the last century. But the question that I have was about the Louisiana coffee. And I guess in a way it ties in with the other references, the Uncle Ben, the entrepreneur. But what was interesting to me was not just seeing the changes over time of the image, but apparently the last one where there was no image, and you talked about it as being perhaps emancipated, and I'm wondering if, in a weird kind of way, if it wasn't actually being quote unquote whitewashed. So we don't even have to deal with them anymore. They're totally out of the picture.
Yeah, I think that's an excellent point, Marilyn. I think whitewash could well have figured in there, but to me it was an interesting contrast to the decision that the company that owns Aunt Jemima made, where they just have felt the need to continually make her over, but they don't want to risk losing customers who are attached to that image on the label. There were probably all kinds of focus groups and so forth conducted to see exactly how they should render that image and have the most purchasers of the product.
Thank you for that wonderful talk. And just one thing that I was curious about, you talked about the contemptible collectibles, and I lived in Oakland, California for about 20 years, and I went to a lot of garage sales, antique stores, and in many, many homes, predominantly African-American areas. And I realized that they played a huge role in Africa. They were a hot seller, and many, many homes that I came in of African-Americans would have these contemptible collectibles sort of predominantly displayed. And I just wonder if you could speak to what purpose or what function that might be serving with.
Sure. There are a couple of things at work there. The first major collector and first major exhibition of contemptible collectibles was the work of Jeanette Faulkner, who was herself from Berkeley, California, neighboring to Oakland, California. And she talked very much in that first exhibit and in the book Ethnic Notions that accompanied the exhibition, and then the documentary that Simon mentioned that I worked on that came also from that exhibition, about the importance of Black people claiming those objects and using the more derogatory of them to tell their children and grandchildren not to take for granted the opportunities that they have now. To say, here is a real visible reminder of what your grandfather and your great-grandfather had to endure. And so that's one of the motivations that people have. There's a sense that with anything that's collectible or antique, and I have heard this in interviews with people on this subject, people are buying them because they think one day they'll be even more valuable and they'll be able to profit from the resale of the items. Some of the domestic items, the ones Mammy cookie jars, the salt and pepper shakers, the aprons, the things that have Black women in them, I've had Black people tell me that they like them just because they find them attractive, they find them aesthetically pleasing. I've had older people talk to me about having bought them when they were real in live time sort of items, because in those days, in the 40s and 50s, they were the only depiction of a Black person anywhere. Black people weren't in magazines, they were very rarely in movies, and a cookie jar at least told you that the world knew you were there. And so versions of that are things that I've heard from people as well. Well, you should get beyond the threshold. One last question, I guess, from yeah.
Hey, thank you, Pat, so much. I wanted to ask a sort of pedagogical question because you're such an excellent teacher, and I wanted to see if you could give us some comments about the ways in which these legends that get perpetrated, the ungrateful victim legend, and as you're teaching these in your classes, I'm sure that there's a number of people in the class who are going to want to say, well, but, etc. I teach classes on representations of Jews in the American public sphere, and it's very much the same, or immigrants, very much the same kind, but don't they really control Hollywood, et cetera, so.
I think it is difficult, but I think that there is a body of scholarship that you can point your students to and connect the cycles that they're familiar with and show how people like Bill Ellis was sitting here a while ago, use Bill Ellis's work, use other scholars who've worked in this area. Alyssa's over there. Give them articles where some other groups, rumors and legends, are being dissected and analyzed and documented, and then ask students to make the move over to the work of their group. There are always some people, and I think it has to do with what I was saying before about religion, there are always people who believe more deeply, and there's no piece of evidence that you could give them to disrupt their notions. But many of our students, they're people who are in college after all. If you use this as an opportunity to talk to them about evidence, if you use this as an opportunity to expand their geography and then their sense of history, I think you can really be persuasive.
With that, thank you all for coming.